Today we're going to be making these dead simple wood floor dungeon tiles. They're super simple to make, they're easy to store, and they're super cheap as well. So enough with the intro, let's get crafting. So to get started, make sure you have a good ruler with a sharp edge, a wire brush. These ones I picked up at the Dollar Tree. And this is an old one that I will actually use because it has a good fanned out bristle pattern. And then a good utility knife or X-Acto knife, and a simple ballpoint pen. This one is empty and it causes problems, so I need to replace it, but it's what I use. And then here we go with the corkboard sheets that have the adhesive backs. And of course, you'll need the foam board. So I got this at the Dollar Tree. So these cork sheets are pretty cool because they have a self-adhesive backing, and that allows you to stick the foam right to it without having to glue, without having to wait for it to dry. They're actually thick, flexible. They have a grip to them, so when you put them on the table, they're not going to slide around. So it's really cool all around. And they're about $20 for a pack of 6. So one thing you have to do with these foam boards is to prepare it by peeling off the paper lining. And sometimes that comes off really easy. This case, it did not. So I had to apply a little bit of water to it, which makes it peel right off. The next step is to cut the foam into the shape of our cork sheets. In this case, these cork sheets were advertised as 12 inches by 12 inches, but they were actually 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters. So very close, but not exact. So I'm just using this as a guide, and I will draw a line. So this pin unfortunately doesn't show up very well in the camera, but it does score the foam enough for me to be able to cut it. And you can see a faint line if I bring it a little bit closer. Yeah, you can see the indent that the pin has made into the foam. So I'll use that line to cut my square. Using a sharp-edged ruler, I line it up carefully, and this utility knife that I use for most of my cutting, you can use an X-Acto knife, but this is what I use. You want to make sure you have a good cutting mat underneath your material that you're cutting through. I use a simple self-healing mat that I found on Amazon, I think for like 20 bucks, but anything will do as long as it's protecting your blade and protecting the surface underneath your material. So there we have it. We have the foam sheet cut out to the same dimensions as our cork sheet, which, if you remember, it was advertised as 12 inches by 12 inches, but it's actually 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters. And we'll need to take note of that because we're going to use that to calculate how many squares we can get. Originally, I wanted to take 3 by 3 inch squares from this sheet, so that would have given me 16 squares. Now I'm going to do some math because I still want to make 16 sheets or 16 tiles. So 30 divided by 4, that's going to give me 7.5 centimeters. So that's what I want to mark on this sheet to make 4 rows of 4 columns. Now, since I want there to be an equal number of wood planks per tile, I decided to go with about 7 millimeters per wood tile or wood plank. So I'm marking that on each side of the sheet. Now that'll give me planks that are slightly larger on the edges, but that's fine. It's really not noticeable once you have it all cut out. So I'll just line the 2 dots up, and I know if I'm lined up with those 2 points, I'm making a straight line perpendicular with the edge. And oops, I'm using my pen. This is probably not a great idea, especially if your pen is empty. The ink inside the pin will actually lubricate when you're running it across this material and will make it fine. But with a dry pin, it starts to tear the edges of the groove line that you're trying to make. So I'm using this X-Acto knife instead. I'm just applying a very light amount of pressure, just the weight of the X-Acto knife, and dragging across the material. So I just want to score the top of it. I don't want to cut through. And there we go. I've scored all of the lines for our wood planking, and you can barely see it in that view, but the lines are scored. Now what I want to do is make them more defined. So I'm going to take my pin and just drag them across those lines. It will follow the path of least resistance, so I'll just place the ballpoint of the pin inside of the groove that I've cut and then just drag it along. I don't need a ruler, don't need to be precise. It's going to usually happen very, very smoothly. But from time to time, if you are quick and trying to rush this like I do, you'll end up jumping out of that groove and making a line inside of where the wood plank would be. That's fine, just stop. I usually turn the foam around the other direction and score it back through that line to make that line more defined. And the line that I jumped would end up just being a more prominent groove in the wood grain. So now we want to define the edges of our squares vertically. So we have the horizontal lines. We want them to be 7.5 millimeters. So I'm marking that in this foam with my pen. So just as a small groove, I'm marking 7.5 inch or centimeters and flipping it around and marking 7.5 centimeters on the other end. So the same technique, I'm going to connect the dots, score the line, and repeat. Now that we know the dimensions, it's a good time to start defining our wood planks. In most tabletop games, each square is 5 feet. Our tiles have 3, so they are 15 feet across. I'm estimating that wood floor boards are about 6 to 8 feet long, so I can assume that each row will have 2 or 3 boards in them. So what I'm doing now is defining that with vertical lines in each plank. So I have my square tiles mapped out or drawn out, and I will randomly place these vertical lines so that they don't stack on top of each other. In general, when you're laying wood floor, even in real construction, you stagger those so that the joints don't meet. That will add some structural integrity to your floors, and it gives it a really cool look. It breaks up the lines and makes it look more flowy. Now, this step is optional, but I think it adds a lot of realism to the look of the finished product. So what I'd like to do is take a sharp pointed object like this little sculpting tool I got at the local dollar store, and you can use a toothpick or a pin or whatever you have handy, and poke little holes where nails would go into these wood planks. So looking at a medieval wood floor in a tavern, you would see these nail holes, usually 2 per board on each end. And so what we do is just represent that by poking holes, and later paint and wash will fill those holes and make them really pronounced and really stand up. So it's a tedious process, but it is well worth it in the end, and it will wow your audience. Now let's give it a little bit of wood texture. So with this little wire brush, I'm going to drag it across the material, slightly waving it as I go to give it a realistic wood pattern. Now it's difficult to tell from this camera view, but it does look amazing. So now that we have that complete, all we have to do now is put the backing onto it, which is this cork sheet. And to do that, we just need to peel off this protective sheet from the back of the cork sheet. And be very careful. This adhesive is very sticky, very tacky, and once you place your material on it, it will not allow you to make any adjustments. So you'll notice here, I accidentally touch it down to the adhesive before I am positioned correctly. So I just have to go with it. I press it on flat. There's a little of the cork board sticking out, and that's fine. We'll trim that up later. The surface of it will still be 7.5 centimeters by 7.5 centimeter squares, so it's going to look great at the in the end. Just a little more trimming that I have to do. So take your time, be careful, and if you do mess up, it is not the end of the world. Okay, now we have the tiles textured. We need to cut them out from the sheet. So we're going to make uh, 7.5 centimeter by 7.5 centimeter squares. I've already scored those lines, and so all I need to do now is take my handy cutting tool, your cutting tool of choice, and place my ruler on those lines that I had scored out earlier, and simply cut these into strips. Now you'll want to press firmly as you're cutting through this material because the cork is a little thick, but you can cut it easily in one pass. And so I'll just continue on making my strips. And there you go. I have these equal sized strips that I will then cut into the individual tiles. And to do that, I could make measurements of 7.5 centimeters along the edges and cut those like we did before, but I rather use this method here. So what I'm going to do is take one of the cut pieces that is 7.5 centimeters or close enough to it and line up the edges just like this, run my finger across the edges just to make sure that it's flush, and then use that as my guide to cut. And I do that because sometimes my cutting isn't that great. So I don't want to be true to the actual measurement. I want to be true to the material that I have. So if the material is slightly bigger or smaller, I want them all to be uniform. And so this helps me to do that, and is also much faster than trying to measure and mark each point on each side of these sheets. So it's a much quicker process. As you'll notice, I'm placing the guide sheet upside down onto the foam so that the foam is directly laying on top of the foam that I'm cutting. And I'm doing that because the top is going to be squared. It's going to be the 7.5 centimeters. The bottom, the cork, as you remember, I didn't place it perfectly, so those aren't going to be true like the tops will be. And speaking of which, it is time to trim those edges. So I'm going to take where the cork is peeking out behind the foam, and I'm just going to use my cutting tool and cut those edges off nice and clean. So just press firmly and drag straight across the edge. I do like to angle the blade so that it's cutting um, at a slight angle into the cork so that if it's not a perfect straight line, you're not going to see it from the top. Now, before we can paint, we need to finish up the edges. So we've just cut these out and the edges are sharp and smooth, and we don't want that on our wood pattern. So I'm going to use this wire brush again and just brush the edges, noticing that on the short ends, I'm using that short up and down motion, and then on the end, I'm dragging it across the length so that it will mimic the wood grain patterns that are on the top. And just continue that process. It's fairly quick. Now we're on to the painting bits. So I use this base coat that is a formula from Black Magic Craft. I think it's called Black Magic Craft base coat. You can find the link in the description on how to make this. It's fairly easy. And what you'd want to do is just coat the entire surface and the edges. Sometimes I water this down a little bit, just slightly, just so it helps it flow into the crevices easier. But in this case, I just took it directly from the bottle. Now this will give it a nice hard finish. It'll protect the foam so it doesn't pick up any more groove lines that you didn't want as you play on them and your players slam their minis onto them. But it also allows it to accept the next layer of paint a lot easier. Speaking of which, it's time to coat in brown. So using this cheap craft paint, you don't want to use anything really expensive because it's just going to be lost on this. So your cheap craft paint from your local box store or from your dollar store would do just fine in this process. So here I'm going to use just an old cheap brush and get it a little bit wet. I'm gonna place some water on this palette and mix it up just to thin that paint out a little bit so it flows into the crevices and gives me a nice even coat. So I'm coating this with a rather ugly brown, and we'll fix that later. But you can use any base color that you want. Some wood is more gray tones, some blue tones, green. There's a lot of variations in wood patterns. So do some research and find the look you're going for and just have at it. In this case, this is very standard rustic looking brown. And with the highlights and washes we'll do later, it really stands out, really pops. Just make sure you get all of the edges as well, especially where your fingers are. You can notice I paint my fingers more than the material sometimes, and just evenly coat it. There we go. Now onto the highlighting stage. We're going to dry brush with this khaki color, this tan or beige color, um, but we're going to mix the brown that we already used in with this to darken it a little bit and to make the tones blend a little bit better between layers. There is no formula that I use to make this highlight color. I just eyeball it, add a little bit of the darker brown, the base coat brown, and more of the beige color, and that gives a good highlight, good contrast to the wood grain. So I just mix it right here on my palette, and we'll get a color that I feel like would be a good highlight. And clean off my brush and begin the dry brushing process. If you haven't dry brushed before, the process is fairly simple and it works across multiple um, painting applications. So you simply get your paint loaded onto the brush and then use something like a napkin or your hand to brush off most of the paint, like I'm doing here, and then just lightly drag the brush across in broad strokes against the grain of whatever you're painting. In this case, it's wood, so the wood grain would be going horizontal to the way I'm holding it, and I'm brushing vertically to catch those raised edges. If I do go with the grain, what will happen is that the brush will sink in further to the material and deposit more paint, and you'll end up covering that base coat. And if that happens, it's okay. You can go back and touch it up with brown and reapply as needed. Don't forget to go around the edges and go against the grain, and there you have it. You can see the comparison of the two, the before and after. Sorry, the camera doesn't focus very well. There we go. And we'll just repeat that process. Now that the first highlight is completed, I'm going to go back through each tile and using a lighter mixture of this beige color, I'm still mixing it with the dark brown, but in a greater proportion of the beige color. So I want it to be almost completely that beige color, but still with the base color mixed into it. And what I'm doing now is just going to pick out individual planks in random patterns and brush uh, going along with the grain this time. Still a dry brush technique, still using very light pressure, but I have more paint loaded on my brush and I'm going with the grain so it's picking up more. It's soaking in the paint a little bit more onto the subject. So it gives it a little darker tone. I'm not covering it completely. It's difficult to tell from this camera angle, but it still has a variation of color. It's not completely beige, and it will look great once it's dried and once we apply our wash. And it's okay if you overbrush onto a adjoining plank like I did here. It's just a matter of wiping it off with your finger. The paint is still wet. It's still using the same tones, the same colors, so it will blend in nicely, and you won't notice any overbrushing as long as you don't get too carried away. I think these turned out really well. The contrast really makes it look natural. Looks like a natural floor that you would see, and very little effort to do so. Now that the highlights are done, we can apply a wash, and that will help the wood grain, the nail holes that we spent so much time poking, and the wood plank seams to stand out, to pop out, and really give it some more definition. What I do is I use this homemade wash that I got the recipe from Black Magic Crafts. I'll link to the description below. And just apply an even coat across the entire tile. And be sure to let it fully dry before continuing. Now that wash will darken the entire surface because we applied it across the entire tile. You can play with how dark you want it. This is the look I was going for. It got a little too dark for me, so I'm going to apply another highlight dry brush on top of it just to pick up some of the details that got muted out during that wash. So you'll notice I'm doing a much lighter dry brush than I was in the previous steps, and that's because I just want to pick out the top layer of the grain. So just to give it a little bit of color back, I still want these to be kind of uh, dark wood look to them. So that's the approach I'm making. You might want yours lighter, so feel free to experiment with your tiles. And that's a wrap. You have created, if you've been following along, 16 of these cool little dungeon tiles. You still have 5 of those sheets of cork left if you bought the same pack I did, and you can let your imagination go wild, create more of those different sizes maybe, and or you can do what I did and create other textures like stone or cobble and spruce up, give you some options when you're playing. And in an upcoming video in this series, I will show you how I made those. They're very simple, same techniques used to build these, but with some variations on how I texture the tiles.